another healing story, one where I am tempted to say, why did healing happen then and not now? Why does it happen sometimes and not always? But this one is one most of us know pretty well, the healing of blind Bartimaeus. It's one of the ways that we know that Jesus is capable of anything, including healing miracles, no matter how problematic we find them to be. But there's more of this if we look a little bit deeper. First of all, the text makes a point of telling us that Bartimaeus is the son of Timaeus, which is honestly pretty self-explanatory if you look at the word, his name, Bartimaeus, literally son of Timaeus. But I think the reason that the text makes this clear is because Timaeus means unclean one. So that's how people in Jesus' day thought about disability. It was somebody's fault. And in this case, supposedly, it was Bartimaeus' father's fault. He was unclean, whatever that meant. At any rate, the text doesn't tell us why. It just tells us that Timaeus was Bartimaeus' father, and we're expected to know that that name means unclean. But that's not how we think about disability today. I'm always aware when I preach about these healing stories that it's so easy to slip into ableist language and attitudes. It's really easy to assume that we know what Bartimaeus needs. But that's not what the story actually tells us. It says that when Bartimaeus realized who was coming near him, he began to cry out. And he identified Jesus in a way that no one had done in this gospel so far. Son of David. That's an important distinction. That says that Jesus is somebody worthy of note. That Jesus is the Messiah that they've all been waiting for. And it's Bartimaeus who acknowledges that for the very first time. So Jesus and the disciples are coming near to this person who is truly unremarkable by all standards. He's sitting by the side of the road, he's poor, he's blind, and he's begging in order to just survive. That's all he's got. And he is the one who knows who Jesus is. But the crowd tries to shush him. That doesn't surprise me. Have you ever lived in a big city, or even been to a big city? When I lived in Boston, well, Cambridge, Massachusetts, I used to go to Harvard Square at least 2 or 3 times a week. Very touristy, very busy, very bustling. And every time I would encounter people who had nowhere to go, nowhere to live. There was a guy named Chip, who was a friend of April's that she talked to every time she went to the square. There was a group of teens and young adults that hung out by the entrance to the T. That's what we call the subway in Boston. There were any number of people begging in front of the CVS. And it was easy to ignore them. You can easily imagine what Harvard Square is like. Wealthy kids from Harvard milling around along with the wealthy people who could afford to live in Cambridge and those of us who were in school there. And most of us were in school, well, many of us, were in divinity schools. Episcopal Divinity School, Harvard Divinity School. So it was kind of on us to know how to relate to the people who were around us. And sometimes we did, and sometimes we didn't. And I'll confess that just like many others, it was often my tendency to just keep the people quiet. Don't come after me. I don't want my safety disrupted. I don't want my day disrupted. April, though, used to stop and have these theological conversations with her friend Chip. He loved hearing about what she was learning in her classes. But in general, most of us did what the crowd in our text today did. We pretended that those folks didn't exist, that we didn't hear them or see them. And for sure, some of the residents of Cambridge asked for laws and ordinances to get those folks out of their sight. They asked for laws to make it illegal to beg, to talk to tourists, to advocate for what you need. It's embarrassing. I'm sure that's what the crowd was thinking in today's story, though, when they told Bartimaeus to shut up. He called out the truth that he knew, Jesus, son of David, and he asked for something. Show me mercy. And the crowd tried to shut him up. But it didn't work. He didn't give up. He kept asking for mercy. And here's what's interesting. Jesus didn't assume that he knew what was best for Bartimaeus. I mean, that's something we all do, right? We encounter someone with a disability or someone who's not neurotypical or someone who's living outside, and we assume that we know what they need. They need healing or fixing or a roof over their head or whatever. We think we know, except when we don't. My first job out of seminary was an internship. And in my mid-40s, it was the first time I had had an opportunity to work with people who lived on the streets. People who were coming to a soup kitchen, struggling to get something to eat. And I learned something very interesting. There was a guy that I talked to almost every day at the soup kitchen. His name was Raul. He came early to get out of the cold usually, and he stayed as long as he could. He made sure that he and his friends got a hot meal, and he always tried to take some leftovers out with him. Many times, social workers, pastors, well-meaning interns like me tried to find him a bed in a shelter, but he declined. He explained to me that he didn't want to be inside. Even in the dead of winter in Connecticut, he preferred to live outdoors, in parks, near rivers, and on his own. If forced on the coldest days of the year, he would go inside, but never for long. He said it just wasn't in his nature to live indoors. All he could say was, "That's not for me." He hated the idea of being in a shelter with other people. And this was the first time I had ever encountered anyone who preferred to remain in this situation rather than getting out of what I thought of needing help. Raul was very clear that living in shelters was not an option for him. He didn't like being inside. He didn't like being around a lot of people. He didn't really mind living outdoors. He felt freer and safer than in a shelter or an apartment. But it was hard for any of us who worked in the social service agencies to hear that. I mean, surely we knew better than he did, right? What was best for him. Surely he needed to sleep indoors like normal people. Surely he needed what we could give him. But he didn't. Raul told me, living outdoors felt like freedom and making his own choices for his own life. It was what he wanted, and he didn't want any of us do-gooders messing with his choices. And I hear something like that in the story of Bartimaeus. He cries out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." But Jesus doesn't assume that he knows what "have mercy on me" means. He asks, "What do you want me to do for you?" And by that question, Jesus is not assuming that Bartimaeus' blindness is the worst thing in his life. He's also not assuming that he knows what Bartimaeus needs. And only after Bartimaeus answers the question, "What do you want me to do for you?" does Jesus act. And I wonder if the blindness was the worst thing. Or was it that Bartimaeus couldn't survive as a blind person without having to beg others for his living and his sustenance? I mean, what if there had been a safety net in place that took care of him, no matter his status as sighted or unsighted? I mean, what if everyone could get health care and it didn't cost anything to get it? I mean, what if we took care of one another? We truly cared for one another. What if there was a more sustainable way for him to deal with his needs than begging at the gate? What if the crowd had actually listened to him long before Jesus came along? What if we, in our present day and time, what if we put the health and safety of every human being above profits and money and capitalism and getting ahead? Can you even imagine it? So who are we listening to right now? And more importantly, who are we failing to listen to? Who is out there on the margins crying out, "Have mercy on us"? Who is crying out for us to do something different, to honor their humanity, to not let the crowd shut them up? Who might be embarrassing for us to acknowledge because they don't look or smell or behave like the rest of us? That is always the question that the good news of Jesus is asking us. Who is left out? Who is the crowd trying to silence? As we at MCC of the Palm Beaches move into our next 40 years, I wonder who we will discover that we have neglected. Not because we meant to, not because we're bad people, but because it is the nature of human beings to ignore folks on the margins. Where are our margins? What will we discover as we continue? Who do we have left to reach out to? Who isn't hearing the message of God's inclusive and transformational love? As a church, we know we have the good news to share. And just like Jesus in our gospel story today, we only need to ask this hurting world, "What do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you?" The answer may be harder than we imagine, but it will always lead us in the direction of following Jesus and of following his love for every human being.